The rain in Detroit doesn't clean anything. It never did. It just takes the grime from the sidewalks and spreads it thin like a man trying to stretch a single dollar across a week of meals. Cole Harwick had lived in this city long enough to know that. He had watched it happen to the streets outside his window for 38 years. But on the night of October the 4th, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a pink piece of paper in front of him, Cole felt for the first time in his life that the rain wasn't falling on the city. It was falling on him specifically, personally, like it had been aimed. The paper was a final notice of eviction. The font was bold. The language was polite the way a closed door is polite. It didn't yell. It didn't threaten. It simply informed him, in the calm bureaucratic language of inevitability, that he and his 4 children had 48 hours to vacate the premises at 1140 Clement Street Apartment, 2B, Detroit, Michigan. Cole set the paper face down on the table and looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had worked. Thick across the knuckles, permanently stained at the creases with engine grease that no amount of soap had ever fully removed. Hands that had spent 15 years inside the guts of diesel engines at Kowalski Auto, coaxing broken machines back to life with patience and intuition and the particular intelligence that lives in the fingers of men who understand how things are built. Hands that had been idle for 3 months now, ever since the shop had closed its doors without warning on a Tuesday morning and left 12 men standing in a parking lot with their final paychecks in brown envelopes and no answers and nowhere particular to go. He had $42.17 in his checking account. He knew the exact number because he had checked it 4 times that day, as though repetition might change the result. It never did. The number sat there with the patient indifference of a fact that does not require your acceptance to remain true. Above him, the ceiling groaned. The tenant upstairs shifted his weight, and a thin cascade of dust fell from the light fixture and settled into Cole's coffee. He didn't move to wipe it away. He just sat there listening to the rain on the basement windows, listening to the drip from the kitchen faucet that he had reported to the landlord 6 times, and that had been dripping for 11 months, feeling the specific weight of a man who has done everything right by the standards he was given and has still ended up exactly here. He had worked every shift offered. He had never called in sick unless he was genuinely sick, and sometimes not even then. He had kept his tools clean and his work careful and his word reliable, and he had raised 4 children alone after his wife died of an aneurysm on a Wednesday afternoon 3 years ago while he was at work, and he had done all of that without asking anyone for anything, because asking had always felt like the beginning of a longer diminishment. And here he was at the kitchen table at midnight in the rain with $42 and a pink piece of paper and the sound of his upstairs neighbor's footsteps measuring out the ceiling above him like a slow, indifferent clock. Then he heard the sound that always found him at the worst moments. It was soft at first, a high, thin whistling. The kind of sound that a person who had never heard it might mistake for a draft coming through a cracked window. Cole knew better. He had learned to distinguish that sound from every other sound that an old building makes at night, and he was on his feet before his brain had finished processing it, moving on the instinct of a father who has spent 2 years listening for that particular note in the dark. Rosie was standing in the doorway of the bedroom she shared with her 3 siblings. She was 6 years old and small for her age, and she was holding a stuffed bear that had lost its left eye 2 Christmases ago in an incident involving Sam and a pair of scissors that had never been fully explained. She hadn't asked for a replacement eye. She had named the bear Patches and loved him harder for the missing one, with the complete and unsentimental logic of a 6-year-old who has decided that what a thing lacks is simply part of what it is. Now she was pressing Patches against her chest, and her small shoulders were rising and falling with the labored, uneven rhythm that Cole had learned to recognize in the dark, the rhythm that meant her lungs were working too hard for too little air. Her asthma had been getting worse for 6 months. The damp in the apartment walls was part of it. The mold behind the baseboards that the landlord had also not addressed was part of it. The fact that she was 6 years old and small and her lungs were still learning the world was part of it. None of these parts were within Cole's power to fix tonight. He crossed the room in 3 steps and picked her up, and she wrapped her arms around his neck with the complete trust that only very young children possess. The trust that says, I don't understand what's wrong, but you're here so it will be all right. The trust that lands in a parent's chest like a stone and a gift at the same time. Cole carried her to the couch and sat down and began the breathing exercise the doctor had shown him. Slow, steady, like blowing out a candle, one breath at a time. He counted with her, his voice low and even, keeping the fear out of it, the way you keep water out of a basement, by constant vigilance and careful maintenance. The nebulizer medication was running low. He had checked that morning. A refill would cost $60 without the insurance that had ended when Kowalski Auto closed. He had $42. While Rosie breathed, Cole looked around the living room. Danny's high school textbooks stacked on an upturned milk crate because there was no desk, and there had never been money for a desk. Claire's worn sneakers by the front door, the left one repaired with a strip of electrical tape across the toe, because the sole had separated and new sneakers cost $30, and $30 was not a number that existed in their current financial reality. Sam's drawings taped into the refrigerator in careful rows, pencil sketches of buildings and bridges, and mechanical things, the work of a 10-year-old boy who noticed how the world was assembled and felt compelled to record it. And then this room, this small and damp and inadequate room, with its mold behind the baseboards and its ceiling that wept in heavy rain, and its single overhead bulb that flickered when the wind came off the river, which was most evenings from October through March. This was what Cole had built. This was the full extent and sum of it. And in 48 hours, the sheriff was coming to put it all on the curb. He sat with Rosie until her breathing evened out, and she fell asleep against his shoulder, her fingers loosening their grip on patches by degrees as sleep took her down. He carried her back to the bedroom and tucked her in and tucked the bear in beside her and stood for a moment in the doorway, listening to the breathing of all four of his children. Danny, 17, frowning even in sleep, as though his dreams required the same skeptical attention he gave his waking hours. Claire, 15, curled on her side with her hair across her face, composed even in sleep, in the way she had been composed since the age of 12, when she had understood that someone in this family needed to be composed and had elected herself. Sam, 10 years old, one arm flung out across the mattress, his fingers loose and open, the way children sleep when the dark has not yet become something they need to defend against. And Rosie, small and steady now, her chest rising and falling without the whistle. Cole stood in the doorway for a long time, Then he went back to the kitchen, turned the eviction notice face up, and sat with it until the sky outside the basement windows began to lighten, from black to the specific dark gray that precedes dawn in a city that never goes entirely dark. The mailbox the next morning held one item. It was a thick cream-colored envelope made of paper that felt like it had been manufactured specifically to communicate importance, the kind of paper that understood its own weight and expected you to understand it too. The return address was embossed in gold lettering that had been pressed into the envelope rather than printed on it. Aldrich and Crane Law Associates, Boston, Massachusetts. Cole opened it, standing on the sidewalk in his slippers, the morning drizzle soaking through his t-shirt, in the way that October rain in Detroit doesn't ask permission before it reaches you. The letter informed him of the death of his paternal uncle, Virgil Harwick. It requested his presence at the reading of the estate in the Boston offices of Aldrich and Crane. It said the matter was of significant legal consequence, and that time was of the essence. It said his travel expenses would be reimbursed by the estate. It was signed by someone named Charles Aldrich, attorney at law, and the signature was the signature of a man who had signed many important documents and had developed a signature to match. Cole stood there for a long moment with the rain running down the back of his neck and read the letter twice. Uncle Virgil. He had last seen the man when Cole was 8 years old at a family gathering in Cleveland that Cole remembered mostly as a collection of adult voices and the smell of someone's perfume, and a long car ride home during which his father had said in the particular quiet voice that adults use when they want children to believe they are not being addressed, that Virgil had gone off the deep end again. Cole had understood from context that the deep end was not a swimming pool. Virgil Harwick was the family's designated eccentric, the one who had broken from the mold and gone east and been swallowed by some combination of stubbornness and bad real estate decisions, and whatever private obsession had kept him from ever coming back to the life he had left. The family consensus, assembled over decades of limited information and maximum speculation, was that Virgil had lost his mind at some point in the 1980s and had been losing it steadily ever since. That whatever he had gone looking for on the Maine coast had consumed him completely. That he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of going your own way. Cole folded the letter, put it in his jacket pocket, and went inside. He told the children to find their shoes. The law offices of Aldrich and Crane occupied the 14th floor of a building in downtown Boston that had been designed by someone who believed that architecture should function as a form of social pressure. The ceilings were high enough to make you feel that your own height was insufficient. The carpets were thick enough to absorb footsteps entirely so that you arrived in a room without the usual announcement of your own approach. The air smelled of leather and the particular variety of money that is old enough to have become indistinguishable from taste. Everything in the space communicated, without saying so directly, that the people who worked here made consequential decisions about the lives of other people and were appropriately furnished for the responsibility. Cole and his 4 children were plainly out of place in a way that went beyond clothing, though the clothing was part of it. Danny wore a hoodie with a fraying left cuff and the expression of a young man who had decided in advance to distrust everything he was about to see, a decision Cole recognized as both reasonable and self-protective. Claire had worn her best dress, a thrift store find in dark navy blue, that she had pressed with the iron that morning, with the particular care of someone who understands that presentation is a form of argument, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her back straight, and her face arranged in the composed expression of a person making a determined case for her own legitimacy in an unfamiliar room. Sam sat beside her with his jacket zipper moving up and down under his fingers, his eyes traveling around the room with the systematic attention of a boy cataloging how things were constructed and what held them together. And Rosie held Patches against her chest and leaned against Cole's arm and watched the adults across the table with the full unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned that watching people too directly makes them uncomfortable. Across the mahogany table sat 2 people. The first was the attorney, a thin man in his 50s named Charles Aldrich, with the precise and careful manner of someone who has spent a long career delivering news that falls into one of 2 categories and has learned to deliver both with identical professional composure, as though the difference between very good and very bad is a matter of perspective that is not his to supply. The second was a woman Cole recognized only at the edges of memory. Marcia, the stepdaughter from Virgil's brief and failed second marriage sometime in the early 90s, a union that had lasted 4 years and produced nothing except this woman who was now sitting across from Cole in a coat that probably cost more than Cole's monthly rent and checking the time on a watch, in the way of a person who has somewhere better to be and is willing to let that fact be known. There was a third person at the table, someone Cole had not been introduced to, a man in a charcoal suit sitting slightly back from the table beside Marcia, with a briefcase on the floor beside his chair. He had the look of an attorney but had not been introduced and said nothing throughout the proceedings and kept his face in the careful neutral of someone who is present in a professional rather than personal capacity. Aldrich opened the file and began. The language was dense and the sentences were long, in the way that legal sentences are long, each subordinate clause doing a specific job that someone had decided was necessary. But the meaning was simple enough, assembled out of the complexity, the way a shape assembles out of fog as you approach it. To his stepdaughter, Marcia Virgil Harwick, left the entirety of his liquid cash assets totaling $350,000. Marcia made a sound. It was the compressed, involuntary sound of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a specific door to open and has just heard the lock disengage. It was not dignified, and she did not appear to care. Cole's knuckles went white on the armrest. He felt the number move through him like a physical thing. $350,000. He ran it against the specific mathematics of his life with the involuntary precision of a man who has spent 3 months calculating the distance between what he has and what he needs. Against the eviction notice folded in his jacket pocket, against $60 for Rosie's medication, against 4 children who needed things that cost money and were going to need more things that cost more money for many years to come. He held very still and waited for Aldrich to continue. To his nephew, Cole Harwick, Aldrich said, a man he had watched from a distance for many years and in whom he placed his remaining trust, Virgil left the remainder of his estate. The remainder. Specifically, Aldrich said, and he slid a thick folder across the mahogany table with the practiced movement of a man who has delivered packages like this before and knows that the contents will require a moment to absorb. The Harwick Grand Hotel located in Craigs Point, Maine. Claire said quietly, the way you say something when you are trying to determine whether saying it out loud will make it more or less real, Dad. We own a hotel, Marcia laughed. It was a short sound, clipped and dismissive, the laugh of a person who is already on the other side of the joke and is watching you arrive at it. Aldrich removed his glasses and set them on the desk with the deliberateness of a man preparing to say something that requires his full face to say it. The Harwick Grand, he said, had been shuttered for 15 years. The property carried $40,000 in unpaid back taxes and outstanding liens. The municipality of Craigs Point, Maine, had designated it a blighted structure under state code. If the property was not brought into compliance with applicable building and habitability codes within 90 days of the transfer of ownership, the state was empowered to seize the property and demolish it at the new owner's expense. The trust included a clause preventing sale for 1 year from the date of transfer. There was a residency requirement attached to the inheritance, meaning the beneficiary was required to occupy the property. And the outstanding debt he added in the flat, even tone of a man who has learned that some sentences are better delivered without inflection, had already transferred to Cole's name as the executor of the estate. The room tilted, not physically. The mahogany table and the thick carpet and the high ceiling stayed exactly where they were. But something shifted in Cole's internal geography, the way ground shifts beneath a man who has been standing on what he believed was solid. He heard himself speak from somewhere slightly outside his own body. He said he could not pay the taxes. He said he had $40. He said this couldn't be what it sounded like. Aldrich said it was exactly what it sounded like. Marcia stood and gathered her coat with the efficient movements of someone whose business here was concluded. She paused at the conference room door and looked at Cole and his 4 children with an expression that occupied the territory between pity and contempt without settling fully in either. "Have fun with the rats," she said. "That place is a genuine ruin. Your uncle died of pneumonia in the lobby because a section of the roof had partially collapsed and the building had no heat." She said it not with cruelty exactly, but with the blunt delivery of a woman who considers sugarcoating a form of disrespect. Then she left. The man in the charcoal suit gathered his briefcase and followed her without having said a single word during the entire proceedings. Cole sat in the silence of the conference room and looked at the folder on the table. He thought about the eviction notice. He thought about Rosie's breathing in the dark. He thought about $42.17 and a $60 prescription and a debt that now had his name on it. Then he pulled the folder across the table and opened it. He went through it page by page, reading carefully the way he read instruction manuals, not skimming, but actually reading, because he had learned long ago that the information that saves you is usually in the part you almost skipped. On the last page of the legal summary at the bottom, there was a handwritten addition in the margin. It had not been typed. It had been written by hand in ink in handwriting that was shaky and uneven, and pressed too hard in some places and too lightly in others, the handwriting of a man who was sick when he wrote it and knew he was sick and wrote anyway because the thing needed to be written. It said, "Cole, the debt is real. The reason is not what you think. Don't sign anything until you understand what's underneath." Cole read it twice. Then he folded the page carefully along a crease that was already there, as though the page had been folded before, as though someone had folded it specifically so it could be folded again, and put it in his jacket pocket without showing it to anyone at the table. He gathered the folder and stood and collected his children with a look and moved toward the door. He was almost to the elevator when Danny touched his arm. The kid's face had the particular alert stillness of a 17-year-old who has learned through the specific education of growing up in a family where money is always short and the margins are always narrow, to pay close attention to what adults are doing when they think no one is watching. "That man," Danny said, "the one sitting next to Marcia, he had a briefcase." Cole waited. "I saw the logo on the side of it," Danny said. "I've seen it before. On Route 1 coming into Maine when we did that camping trip 2 summers ago, it was on a billboard, a development company." Cole turned and looked back through the glass wall of the conference room. Aldrich was on the phone, standing with his back to the door. The chair where Marcia had been sitting was empty. The chair where the man in the charcoal suit had been sitting was also empty. But the man had left his business card on the table, turned face up, and from where Cole stood in the corridor, he could read 2 words printed at the top of it in clean professional type: Goss Capital. Cole stood very still for a moment, in the corridor of the 14th floor of a building designed to make people feel small. He put his hand briefly on Danny's shoulder, not to say anything, just to acknowledge what had been noticed and by whom. Then he walked to the elevator and pressed the lobby button and waited for the doors to close. Whatever was happening with the Harwick Grand had started before Virgil Harwick died. Someone had known about this inheritance before the will was read. Someone with a briefcase and a business card had been sitting in that conference room watching. Cole thought about that for the first 20 miles of the drive north. The drive to Maine took 20 hours, broken into segments by rest-stop naps in the van. The children bundled into whatever combination of jackets and blankets Cole had packed in the duffel bags in the back, taking the sleeping arrangements in shifts, the way sailors take watches. They ate peanut butter on white bread at a picnic table outside a rest stop in Connecticut while the traffic on the highway moved steadily past them, and the smell of exhaust mixed with the smell of pine from a windbreak someone had planted decades ago and which had grown into something useful. Sam drew in his sketchbook. Rosie slept against Claire's shoulder with patches held loosely against her chest, and her breathing easy in the cold, clean air outside the city. Danny sat in the passenger seat for the last stretch through New Hampshire and into Maine, not sleeping, watching the signs count down the miles to a place that was becoming more real with everyone they passed. Maine announced itself before they crossed the state line. The highway narrowed, so the forest pressed in close on both sides, thick stands of pine that filtered the sky into something darker and greener and older that turned the October light the color of shallow water over stone. The air coming through the vents changed composition as they drove, losing the particular urban combination of exhaust and heated concrete and replacing it with salt and wet earth and something underneath those things that Cole couldn't name, something that seemed to predate the road and the trees both. Craig's Point was not the Maine of travel magazines and holiday photographs. It was a working harbor town, the kind of place that had been working for so long and so hard that the working had become its entire identity. And now that the work was contracting, pulled inward by forces that operated at a scale far above the town's ability to influence the place, had the look of someone who has spent their whole life defined by a job that is slowly being taken away from them. Half the storefronts on the main commercial street were boarded with plywood. The ones that remained open had hand-lettered signs and parking lots with grass growing through the cracks in the asphalt. The harbor was still active, fishing boats riding low in the gray water with their outriggers folded, but the infrastructure around the harbor had contracted, leaving the empty warehouses and shuttered processing facilities standing like the bones of a larger economy that had moved on without bothering to take its skeleton. Claire navigated from her cracked phone, directing Cole off the main road and onto a smaller road that climbed away from the harbor in a series of switchbacks up the side of a headland. The van labored against the grade in second gear. The fog was moving in from the ocean, the way fog moves in on the Maine coast in October, not drifting but advancing, with the purposeful and incremental quality of something that has a destination in mind. "There," Danny said. Cole touched the brakes. The Harwick Grand emerged from the fog the way a shipwreck emerges from shallow water, gradually by degrees, the overall shape becoming visible before the details of the damage. You saw the silhouette first, the turrets at the four corners, the steep pitch of the roofline, the wraparound porch, the general proportions of a building that had been built to impress and had in its time succeeded. Only as the fog shifted and the distance closed did the specifics of 15 years of abandonment become clear. The paint had gone first, peeling away from the wood siding in great curling sheets and lying in pale drifts along the base of the building like shed skin. The wood beneath was dark with moisture and what that moisture had encouraged. Several windows on the upper floors were covered with plywood that had itself begun to weather and split. The grand sign above the main entrance, the Harwick Grand, in raised gilt letters on a painted board, hung from a single remaining chain. At one corner, the other chain long since corroded through and turned slowly in the wind off the ocean with the mournful rhythmic movement of a pendulum that has lost its clock. The weeds in the gravel drive had grown waist-high through the summer and had been killed by the first hard frost, leaving brown stalks that rattled in the wind. Beyond the drive, the cliff edge was invisible in the fog, but the sound of waves breaking on rocks far below carried up through the October air with perfect clarity. "It looks like a haunted house," Daddy Rosie said. She was pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass, patches tucked under one arm. Cole looked at the building. He looked at the rot along the siding, The missing shingles on the lower section of the roof, the plywood on the windows, the hanging sign, the $40,000 of back taxes that now had his name on them, the 90 days. He thought about all of it for a moment, held it all together in his mind, and made a decision about what to say. "It's got good bones, baby," he said. He said it with enough steadiness that the two younger children looked at the building again and reconsidered it. Danny looked out the windshield and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They pulled onto the gravel and began lifting the duffel bags out of the back of the van, the five of them moving through the particular efficiency of people who have been living in a small space together for a long time and have worked out the logistics without needing to discuss them. The silence of the clifftop was the heavy occupied silence of a place where the weather is always doing something audible, filled with the sound of water against rock and birds that Cole couldn't see, and the low variable note of wind moving through the gaps in the old Victorian siding. Then the crunch of tires on gravel. The black SUV came up the drive slowly with the unhurried deliberateness of something that doesn't need to hurry because it already owns the destination. It stopped 20 feet from the van, and the engine went quiet, and nothing happened for a moment. A pause that felt calculated, and then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders with the particular tan that comes from spending winters somewhere other than Maine. His suit was dark and fit, precisely the kind of fit that requires multiple appointments with a tailor and costs accordingly. His teeth were very white, in a way that communicated maintenance and investment. His eyes were a shade of gray that appeared in winter skies a few hours before serious weather, and they moved across the Harwick family with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone who is accustomed to evaluating things rapidly and accurately. "You must be the Harwicks," the man said. He spread his arms in a gesture of generous welcome that engaged every part of his presentation except his eyes. "Welcome to the money pit." Cole positioned himself between the man and his children without making a decision to do so. The movement was older than thought. "Who are you?" Cole said. "Warren Goss," the man said, extending a hand. "Goss Capital Development. I own most of the property surrounding this particular parcel." He glanced at the hotel with the practiced expression of a man indicating something he has already assessed and dismissed. "And I'm here because I have a proposal that I believe is going to be very useful to you given the situation you have just inherited." Cole looked at the extended hand. He did not take it. Goss retracted the hand without any visible embarrassment and reached instead into the interior of his jacket. He produced a checkbook and a pen and wrote something and tore the check free and held it up between two fingers. $20,000, Goss said. Same-day cash equivalent. "I'll pay the back taxes out of my own pocket handle. All the demolition costs, take every associated liability off your hands. You sign a quit-claim deed today, and you walk away from here with enough to start over somewhere with heat and a roof that doesn't leak." Cole looked at the check. $20,000. He ran the number against what he knew, against the deposit on a new apartment, against Rosie's medication for a year, against the first year of community college for Danny if financial aid covered the rest, against 6 months of breathing room of not calculating the distance between what was in the account and what the next bill required. It was a number that solved immediate problems in ways that felt very large when you were standing in a gravel driveway with $40 in your wallet. He felt the pull of it, the specific gravitational pull of a solution offered to a man who has been in freefall. "How do you know what the taxes are?" Danny said. Goss looked at the boy. The white smile recalibrated slightly, a small mechanical adjustment. "It's public record," Goss said. "I do my due diligence on properties in the area. It's standard practice. You called us the Harwicks," Danny said, "before we told you our name. And back taxes on an estate and probate aren't public record. They're a part of the sealed estate filing." The pause that followed this was brief and cold, like the moment between a stone leaving your hand and hitting the water. Goss put the checkbook away. The warmth in his expression didn't disappear. It transformed, becoming something more precise and less effortful. "The offer stands for 24 hours, he said. "After that, I have no choice but to contact the county code enforcement office. Once the inspector gets a look at the black mold and the structural violations in there, he'll post a condemned notice before you've had time to unpack. Then the state takes it and you get nothing, and you still owe the debt that transferred to your name in the estate." He moved back to the SUV and opened the door. He paused there with one foot inside his forearm, resting on the roof of the vehicle, in the easy posture of a man who is accustomed to being the last one to speak. "Don't try to be a hero here, Harwick," he said. "Poor men can't afford to be heroes. They never could." The door closed. The SUV moved back down the drive without any change in speed and turned onto Lookout Point Road and disappeared into the fog. Cole stood in the gravel and watched where it had gone. The fog had thickened while they were standing there, and he could no longer see the base of the cliff below them, only hear the waves working against the rocks. He thought about the Goss Capital briefcase in the Boston conference room. He thought about a man who had known their name and their tax obligation before they'd crossed the state line. He thought about a margin note in a dying man's handwriting that said, "Don't sign anything until you understand what's underneath." He turned to face the hotel. The iron key from the estate package was heavy in his coat pocket. He found the front door locked by touch in the dim afternoon light, ground the key into the rust of the mechanism, felt it resist with the stubbornness of 15 years of disuse, and then yield with a sound like a small decision being made. He pushed both doors open. The smell came through first. Damp wood and the deep, pervasive must of a sealed building, and underneath those expected things, something else, something that rose from deeper than the lobby, something mineral and faintly warm that seemed to come from the building's foundations or from somewhere below them. The lobby was vast in the way that the lobbies of grand hotels are vast, designed for an era when arriving somewhere was a ceremony with appropriate proportions. The ceiling was high and ornate, though the plaster had come down in sections and lay in pale fans across the old hardwood floor. The grand chandelier that would have hung at the center had come down too and lay in the middle of the room in a pile of metal and shattered crystal that the dust of 15 years had turned into a soft gray mound. The front desk extended along the far wall, under a curtain of cobwebs, every horizontal surface furred with the accumulated dust of a decade and a half of complete stillness. "Dad," Sam said. His voice echoed off the walls and ceiling in a way that made the lobby feel even larger. "Look at the floor." In the center of the lobby, applied with the confident strokes of someone who had thought about placement, someone had used red spray paint to write two words in letters roughly 2 feet high. "Get out." Cole looked at it. He felt the cold move through him that had nothing to do with the unheated building and everything to do with the fact that they had been here for 4 minutes, and the building already had a message for them. "Them just kids," he said. His voice was steadier than he felt. "Vandalism. It comes off with the right solvent." He found the electrical panel in the utility corridor behind the kitchen, behind a door that stuck in its frame from the swelling of the wood and required a shoulder to open. He threw the main breaker, expecting the nothing of a building that had been dark for 15 years. What he got instead was a low hum that ran through the walls like the beginning of a pulse, and then from somewhere behind the reception desk in the lobby, the single bulb in the original wall sconce flickered and caught and held. Cole stood in the unexpected light and looked at the numbered room key slots on the wall behind the desk. Most were empty, the small brass hooks bare. But in slot 44, visible in the new light, as a dark rectangular shape, against the pale wood of the slot was something that did not belong there, in the way that useful things left for specific people sometimes do not belong exactly where they are because they are waiting. He reached in and took it out. It was a journal. The cover was dark brown leather, worn smooth at the corners from handling the binding intact. He opened it to the first page and read the name written there in handwriting he already recognized from the margin note: Virgil Harwick, his private record. Cole turned to the last entry. The date was 3 days before the date on the death notice in the letter from Aldrich and Crane. The handwriting was uneven here in ways it had not been earlier in the journal, the pen pressing too hard and then too lightly, the lines drifting from the horizontal as though gravity had become inconsistent. "He is circling," Virgil had written. "Goss. He has been circling for years, coming back with better offers and more patience and a longer view. He thinks it is about the land. He thinks I am simply a stubborn old man who does not understand what he possesses. He has never understood what I possess. The water is not a commodity to him. It is a commodity to everyone who sees it the way he sees things. He would extract it at full commercial rate for 10 years and sell the depleted rights to the next buyer and be in Bermuda before anyone noticed what was gone. Cole, if you are reading this, you came. You found the journal where I left it, which means you came inside instead of signing the check on the driveway. I was not certain you would. I want you to know I would not have blamed you if you hadn't. Do not sign anything that man puts in front of you. Do not allow them to take the building. What they want is not the building. It has never been the building. The water is the gold coal. The water is the life. Whatever they tell you this place is worth, you are being told less than the truth. You have to understand what is underneath before you can understand what you have. Cole read it twice, standing at the front desk in the light of the single sconce bulb, the lobby quiet around him except for the distant sound of waves and the wind finding every gap in the Victorian siding. He turned the journal over and looked at the back cover. There was something held against the inside back cover by a strip of yellowed tape barely visible until you were looking for it. He worked the tape loose with careful fingers. It came away from the leather with the dry, faint sound of something very old being asked to move after a long rest. It was a Polaroid photograph. Time had worked on it the way time works on Polaroids, bleaching the colors to soft pastels, the specificity of the original image, becoming a kind of impressionism. But the shapes were clear. Two men standing beside what appeared to be industrial drilling equipment, the kind mounted on a truck, the kind used for sinking deep wells. The man on the left was younger than Cole had ever known him, but recognizable as Virgil, taller and straighter than the old man of family legend, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was not far from one. The man on the right was a stranger to Cole, broader, with the look of someone who worked with his hands. Cole turned the photograph over. On the back in ink that had not faded in handwriting, that was recent and deliberate, someone had written 9 words that had clearly been added long after the photograph was taken. Roy knows everything. Room 3B, Millbrook Home. Trust the water. Virgil had added this inscription recently. The ink was too dark, too present for it to have been written when the photograph was young. He had written it knowing he was dying, knowing Cole would find the photograph, knowing Cole would need a next step. This was not the disorganized bequest of an eccentric. This was a man who had known what was coming and had used what time he had left to build a path for someone else to follow. The journal in slot 44. The margin note in the estate filing. The Polaroid with its fresh ink inscription. All of it placed, all of it waiting. Cole stood with the journal and the photograph and tried to hold the full shape of what was happening. He was not here by accident. He was not here because the family tree had only one branch left. He was here because a dying man had selected him deliberately and had spent his last days making sure the selection was accompanied by everything Cole would need. Not money, not answers, a direction and the tools to find the answers himself. He had $40. He had 4 children who were at this moment arranging themselves for sleep on piles of velvet curtains Cole had pulled from the ballroom because the kitchen was the only room with a door that locked and a cast-iron stove that still held the ghost of its former heat. He had a debt he could not pay, and a building that was scheduled to fall on him, and a check he had not taken from a man who had been waiting for them before they arrived. He had a journal. He had a name. He had the specific stubbornness of a man who has been told his entire life that the situation is what it is and has kept going anyway because there are 4 people watching him to learn what a person does when the situation is what it is. Then came the sound. It was deep and metallic, and it came from beneath the lobby floor from a specific point below where Cole was standing. A single heavy clang, then silence, then the sound of something shifting against stone or concrete. Cole set the journal on the front desk. He picked up the tire iron he had brought from the van that morning. An old one, heavy, reliable, the kind of tool that has been used for enough purposes over enough years to understand it is for whatever needs doing. He moved toward the sound. The corridor behind the kitchen was dark and narrow, and the flashlight beam caught floating particles of dust in long, angled columns. He followed the sound past the old servants' quarters, past doors that had warped in their frames over 15 years of uncontrolled humidity, to a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor, marked with a metal plate that said mechanical. The door was slightly open. He had not opened this door. He had not been in this part of the building. Cole put his back against the wall beside the door, the way he had seen it done in enough movies to have absorbed the basic principle, and then dismissed the theatrical posture and simply kicked the door open and swept the flashlight beam across the room. The boiler dominated the space. It was massive, a hulking iron structure from an earlier era of mechanical engineering, when machines were built to last rather than to be replaced, when the measure of quality was how long a thing would run rather than how cheaply it could be produced. It was cold and completely still dark with rust on the external fittings, inert in the particular way of things that have not been used for so long that they have begun to seem as though they were never meant to be used. Rotting wooden pallets stacked against the far wall, and movement, a shadow separating from the deeper shadow behind the pallets already in motion. Cole yelled something. The figure was already moving. Black jacket, no face visible in the darkness, heading for the maintenance ladder, bolted to the far wall, moving with the specific urgency of someone who has been caught where they were not supposed to be. Cole crossed the room and got his hand on the heel of a boot at the base of the ladder, and the figure drove the other foot back hard, catching Cole across the shoulder, with enough force to put him down. He hit the concrete on one knee, felt the impact move up through his spine, and by the time he had the flashlight up again, the high window at the top of the ladder was broken outward, and the figure was through it and gone into the vom in the dark of the Craig's Point night. Cole stayed on his knee for a moment, shoulder throbbing, breathing. Then he shone the light at the place where the figure had been standing. The pallets had been moved aside from a section of the floor. The concrete here was different from the surrounding floor, worked at chiseled around the edges in a rectangle that exposed the top surface of something set into the original construction. It was a hatch, circular, roughly 3 feet across, set into the concrete and centered on a brass wheel mechanism for opening, the kind of design you see on old water infrastructure in pressure vessels and the hatches of submarines. The metal was heavily corroded, but fundamentally intact. Someone had been working around the edges of it, clearing the concrete that had been poured over it at some point, exposing it for the first time in what looked like decades. Etched into the brass wheel in letters that were still legible beneath the rust in the age were 2 words: Aqua Vitae, 1922. Cole put both hands on the wheel and pulled. The wheel was immovable. He hit it with the tire iron and it rang out in the enclosed stone room like a struck bell, and remained exactly where it was. Dad. Danny was in the doorway holding a kitchen knife in one hand and the flashlight from the kitchen drawer in the other, wearing the face of a 17-year-old who is committed to not showing how frightened he is and is managing it imperfectly. "You okay?" Danny said. Cole looked at the hatch. He looked at the chiseled concrete around its perimeter. He thought about the figure that had come here specifically on the first night in the dark, while a family was asleep 60 feet away, and had been working around this particular hatch. "We're not alone," Cole said. "Goss has people inside already. They're looking for this." "What is it?" Danny said. Cole stood and looked at the 2 words on the brass wheel. He thought about a margin note, about the water is the gold, about a photograph with 9 words of fresh ink on its back. "I don't know yet," Cole said, "but your Uncle Virgil died in this building protecting whatever is down there. And the most powerful man in this county is willing to break in on the first night to get to it before we can understand what it is." He looked at his son in the flashlight beam. Danny looked older than 17 in the light. He looked like someone who has been carrying something heavier than their age for a while and has learned to carry it without showing the effort. In the morning, Cole said, "We find answers." He turned off his flashlight. In the dark of the mechanical room, with the ocean working against the cliff below them, and the wind in the damaged siding, and the hatch sealed in its brass wheel at their feet, Cole sat down with his back against the cold stone wall and the journal in his lap and the tire iron across his knees. He was not going to sign. He was not going anywhere. Whatever was beneath the Aquavitae hatch was going to stay where it was until Cole understood what it meant and why it was worth everything that had been spent to protect it and everything that was apparently being spent to take it. Outside, the fog pressed against the boarded windows of the Harwick Grand, and the Atlantic continued its old patient work against the rocks below the cliff. In the kitchen, 4 children slept on velvet curtains, their breathing soft and even in the dark. Cole sat with the journal and watched the door and waited for morning. Morning came to Craig's Point the way bad news always comes, without announcement, without ceremony. The fog was still pressed against the windows of the Harwick Grand when Cole heard the vehicle on the drive, and he was on his feet before the engine cut because he had not slept, and his body had spent the night in the particular coiled readiness of a man who has learned that the next thing is rarely better than the last. It was a white county van with a magnetic seal affixed to the door. The seal read Code Enforcement Town of Craigs Point in the official font of institutions that have the authority to ruin your morning. The man who stepped out was short and soft through the middle with a clipboard carried against his chest, with both arms the way a person carries something they want to use as a shield, and the careful, efficient movements of someone who has learned to use official authority as a substitute for the personal confidence he does not naturally possess. He was followed by a uniformed police officer who stayed by the van and looked at his phone with the expression of a man who is present as required but is not personally invested in the outcome. "Inspector Vance," the man said when Cole appeared on the porch. He looked past Cole into the lobby with the focused inventory-taking squint of someone who is not looking at a building, but looking for specific items on a list. "We received an anonymous tip regarding unsafe conditions involving minors at this address." Cole stood in the doorway and thought about the black SUV that had been idling at the bottom of Lookout Point Road when he had looked out the window at 11 the previous night. He thought about a man with a checkbook and gray eyes and the specific knowledge of their tax debt before they had arrived. "We got here yesterday," Cole said. Vance had already opened his clipboard. "Date of occupancy is not relevant," he said. "What's relevant is current conditions." He looked up briefly, a bureaucratic glance that conveyed nothing personal. "I'll need full access to the property. Please don't obstruct the process." He spent an hour working through the hotel with the methodical thoroughness of a man who has been told what to find and is finding it. He noted the broken windows on the upper floors with the abbreviated notation of a man who had noted broken windows before. He pressed a finger into the kitchen wall and showed Cole the dark result without saying what it was because they both already knew. He walked the perimeter of the lobby and looked up at the fallen plaster sections and made a sound with his pen against the clipboard that expressed something between disappointment and satisfaction. Cole followed at a distance and watched the way Vance moved. He had been around inspectors before at the shop when OSHA came through, and there was a quality to a genuine inspection that was different from this. A genuine inspector asked questions. Questions were how you built an accurate picture of a situation you were encountering for the first time. Vance was not asking questions. He was confirming things he already knew, checking boxes next to conditions he had been told to find. When it was done, they stood in the lobby. Cole by the front desk. Vance in the center of the room between the fallen chandelier and the get out on the floor, the clipboard against his chest. "The assessment is clear," Vance said. "Structurally compromised sections on floors 2 through 4 confirmed mold presence. Throughout the ground floor, inadequate heating for human habitation in current seasonal temperatures. Under municipal code, I am authorized to post a condemned notice effective immediately and to contact Child Protective Services regarding the welfare of minors found in an uninhabitable structure." Cole felt a cold that had nothing to do with the unheated building move through him. "Give me a chance," Cole said. He kept his voice level. "I can fix this." Vance paused. His pen stopped its movement against the clipboard. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly in the way of an actor who has delivered his line and is waiting for his cue. "There is a provision under municipal code," Vance said, as though he was consulting the relevant section from memory. "A grace period is available if the primary habitability hazard is remediated within a specified time window. The primary hazard here is the absence of functioning central heat. If you can bring the boiler fully online and pass a carbon monoxide test, I can authorize a temporary grace period." He looked at Cole over the clipboard. "The boiler in the mechanical room downstairs is the only heat source in this building. It has not been operational for approximately 20 years. He let the pause carry its own implication. "You have 48 hours. If the system is not running when I return, the condemned notice stands, and I make the call to CPS." He held out the citation form. "For the children's sake, Mr. Harwick, I hope you have some mechanical aptitude." The county van crunched back down the gravel drive. Cole stood on the porch and watched it reach the bottom of Lookout Point Road and turn onto the main street. 40 yards further along the road, parked on the shoulder with no evident purpose, sat a black SUV with tinted windows. It sat there for 10 seconds. Then it pulled out and followed the county van back toward town at the same speed as though they were traveling together. Cole turned and looked at the hotel. 48 hours. He went inside and looked at his 4 children. Danny had his arms folded and was looking at the floor with the expression of someone working through a problem they have not yet fully defined. Claire was standing with one hand on Rosie's shoulder, her jaw set, her eyes direct and steady, in the way she had been direct and steady since she was 12 years old and had decided that someone needed to be. Sam was looking up at the ceiling of the lobby, following the path of an old pipe that ran through the plasterwork. Rosie was looking at Cole with patches under one arm, waiting. "Get your coats," Cole said. "All of you. We're going into town." Betty's Hardware occupied a narrow storefront 3 blocks from the harbor, wedged between a closed insurance office and a bait shop that was earning its smell. The bell above the door rang when Cole pushed it open, and the woman behind the counter looked up from her newspaper and assessed the situation in the direct, economical way of someone who has spent a lifetime deciding quickly what to do with what comes through her door. She was somewhere past 60 with gray hair, pulled back in a practical knot, in the hands of a woman who had spent her working life handling things that mattered. She looked at Cole's face where the night he had not slept was visible. She looked at the 4 children arranged behind him. She looked back at Cole with the expression of someone who has already formed a hypothesis and is waiting for confirmation. "You moved into the Harwick," she said. "Yesterday," Cole said. Betty folded the newspaper. "Warren Goss has been buying up this town for 2 years," she said without preface or preliminary. "Storefronts, rental properties, commercial leases. My rent went up 40% in January. 2 of my neighbors on this block closed because of it." She said it flatly, the way you state a fact that requires acknowledgement before anything useful can proceed. "He wants that cliff-top land for a luxury resort development. The hotel is the last thing standing in his way." Cole put both hands on the counter and listed what he needed. Valve fittings, pipe gaskets, sealant compound for iron threads, wrench sets in 2 sizes, a torch kit for frozen components. He listed it with the specificity of a man who has spent 15 years coaxing broken machinery back to function and knows exactly what a 20-year dormant boiler requires. Then he said he had no money to pay for it. Betty listened to the list without writing anything down. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating expression of a person arriving at a decision that has nothing to do with commerce. "Pay me when you beat him," she said. She turned and began pulling items from the shelves behind her, moving with the efficiency of someone who knows every inch of her own space. She assembled the fittings and the torch kit and the wrenches and set them on the counter. Then she reached under the counter and set a folded envelope beside the pile. $80, Betty said. "For gas and whatever else you end up needing that isn't on this counter." She said it before Cole could respond. "Don't argue with me about it." She looked at him steadily. "Combined with what you have, it'll be enough." Cole looked at the envelope. He thought about $42 an hour ago, and now 80 more, and a woman he had met 4 minutes ago who had handed it across a hardware store counter without being asked. "There's one more thing you need," Betty said. She pulled her coat from the hook behind the register. "The boiler in that building is a specific machine from a specific era, and it's been dead for 20 years. You need someone who has actually worked on it." She was already moving toward the door. "Millbrook Home is on Elm Street, room 3B. His name is Roy. Tell him Virgil sent you." She said it as though the matter was fully settled, which Cole was learning was how Betty said things when they were. Roy Callahan occupied room 3B of the Millbrook Home on Elm Street with the contained presence of a man who has accepted his circumstances without being diminished by them. He was 88 years old and had been large once and had not entirely ceased being large, his frame still broad across the shoulders, his hands resting on the armrests of his wheelchair, with the particular stillness of hands that remember significant work. His eyes were a clear, sharp blue that time had not touched the eyes of a man who has been watching things carefully for a very long time. He looked at the Polaroid photograph Cole put on the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking, his expression undergoing something internal and private. "Virgil is gone, then," he said. 3 weeks ago, Cole said. "I'm his nephew. I inherited the hotel." Roy looked at the photograph for another moment. "He and I were 23 when that was taken," he said. He picked it up and held it at the distance his eyes required. "We were drilling the test bore for the aquifer survey." He set it down. "You have 48 hours to get the heat running. Not a question." "Yes," Cole said. Roy nodded once. He reached for the pen on his side table and pulled a paper napkin from the holder beside his water glass. His hand shook with the tremor of age, but the lines he drew were confident, the certainty of a man drawing from deep memory rather than current deliberation. He drew the boiler, the main intake housing, the position of the bypass valve, the pressure gauge with a mark at 50. He drew the path of the steam through the system, and beneath it, connected by a line, he drew with particular care the pump system that fed up from below. "I'll tell you what Virgil built down there," Roy said as he drew. He spoke without looking up from the napkin, his voice steady and unhurried in the way of very old men who have stopped rationing what they say because they understand that time is the commodity they have least of. In 1920, a bootlegger named Cornelius Vane built the Harwick Grand. He did not build it for the guests. He built it over a geological anomaly he had found while sinking a well for water access. A thermal aquifer, deep pressurized, highly mineralized. Magnesium, lithium, sulfur compounds natural carbonation from the geological pressure. He bottled it and sold it during Prohibition as a health tonic to launder the rum money. The state shut him down in 1934 and capped the well access. Roy looked up from the napkin. But the aquifer didn't care about state orders, he said. It kept running. Virgil found the original survey records in the 1960s when he bought the hotel. He had the aquifer independently tested. He filed for and received grandfathered water rights from the state of Maine in 1968 tied to the continued ownership of the surface parcel. He set the pen down. Those rights are worth more than everything Goss has ever built. Bottled luxury water with a natural mineral profile like that aquifer carries is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The rights alone are conservatively worth $200 million. Cole was very still, but only Roy said if the building stands. The rights are grandfathered and they are tied to the parcel. If the building is demolished, the rights revert to the state, and Goss has the connections in Augusta to buy them back from the state for a fraction of their value within 6 months of the reversion. He looked at Cole directly. Goss doesn't want a golf resort, son. He never did. He wants to own the water. Roy pushed the napkin across the table. The bypass valve is on the back of the main intake housing, he said. After 20 years, it will be completely seized. You heat it with the torch until the metal changes color, then at exactly 50 psi on the gauge, you hit it with a sledgehammer. Not 48, not 52, 50. He held Cole's eyes. If you hit it right, the valve opens, the pressure equalizes steam, clears the lines, the heat comes up throughout the building. He paused. If you miss the mark, or you go early or late, the boiler fails in an enclosed stone basement. I don't need to finish that sentence. Cole folded the napkin carefully and put it in his jacket pocket beside the journal. He asked one question. Why did Virgil shut the hotel down in the first place? Roy was quiet for a moment. Through the window of room 3B, the October sky over the parking lot was the color of old pewter. Because Goss came to him with the same offer 15 years ago that he's making you now, Roy said. And Virgil was too old and too alone to fix the boiler himself, and the county condemned it on violations that appeared from nowhere 6 months after he refused Goss the first time. So Virgil shut the hotel to stabilize it, kept paying the taxes year by year on a pension to prevent the state from taking it, waiting for someone who could fix what he couldn't fix. He looked at Cole with the direct, economical gaze of a man who no longer bothers with indirection. You're a mechanic, Roy said. Virgil watched you for years. He knew what you could do. He just needed you to stay long enough to do it. Cole said nothing for a moment. He thought about a dying man paying taxes for 30 years on a condemned building. He thought about a Polaroid with fresh ink on its back. He stood and picked up his coat. Thank you, Cole said. Roy waved the thanks away with one large, still hand. Virgil did the hard part, he said. He held it. You just have to unlock it. The basement of the Harwick Grand was cold enough that their breath came in continuous visible clouds, and the work light Cole had rigged from the electrical panel was a single bulb on an extension cord that threw hard shadows across the boiler and the pipes and the two figures working at its base. Cole and Danny. Claire had taken Rosie and Sam to the ballroom on the opposite side of the hotel, the farthest point from the mechanical room, with blankets from the closet on the second floor, and Sam's sketchbook and Rosie's bear. She had told them a story to settle them, making it up as she went with the practical capability of a 15-year-old who has learned that someone always needs to be the one who holds things together and has made her peace with being that someone. Cole had set the tool bag open on the floor beside the boiler and laid out Betty's fittings and wrenches in the order he would need them. Among the tools, a short pry bar sat against the boiler housing one of the items Betty had packed with the foresight of someone who had thought through what a seized 20-year dormant system would require. He set it where he could reach it. Danny handed tools when Cole needed them and held the light steady when Cole needed both hands and said nothing for a long time. The silence between them had a different quality than the defensive silence of the past 3 months. It was the silence of a young man paying serious attention, learning something about his father that ordinary circumstances had not previously provided an occasion to see. "Tell me about her," Danny said. He was holding the light on the bypass valve housing while Cole worked the torch around its base. Cole kept the torch moving. "Your mother," Danny said, "when you first met her, what she was like." Cole thought about the question with the care it deserved. He thought about a 22-year-old woman in a diner in Dearborn who had laughed at something he said and then immediately looked surprised by her own laughter, as though joy was something that occasionally ambushed her, and she found it both welcome and startling. He thought about the way she had held Rosie 3 hours after Rosie was born, looking down at her daughter with an expression that existed in no language Cole had ever learned. "She was the most honest person I ever knew," Cole said. "She couldn't pretend things were fine when they weren't. I used to think that was difficult to be around." He moved the torch to the next section of the housing. "Later I understood it was the bravest thing about her. Most people spend enormous energy pretending. She didn't have that energy, and she didn't see the point." Danny was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to end up like this," Danny said. He said it without accusation. Just plainly the way you say a true thing when you are too tired to soften it. Broke at 40 with nothing to show. Cole looked at his son over the torch flame. "You think I wanted this," Cole said. "No," Danny said. "I think you did everything you were supposed to and still ended up here. That's actually worse than choosing it. That's the part I can't figure out." The torch hissed between them. "Yeah," Cole said. "It is worse." He turned back to the valve housing. "But the thing you find out when everything goes wrong, the way everything has gone wrong, is what you're actually made of, not what you assumed you were made of. The actual material. And your kids are watching you the whole time to learn what a person does in this specific situation." He looked at Danny. "So the only question that matters is, what do they see?" Danny held the light on the valve housing without moving for a long moment. "They see someone who stays," Danny said. The pressure gauge climbed. 10 psi. The pipes above them began to speak a low, resonant groan from metal, waking up the sound of a system remembering what it was made to do. 20. A thin whistle developed somewhere in the upper pipe network, a hairline crack finding its voice as the pressure built. 30. The boiler casing began to vibrate at a frequency Cole could feel in the soles of his boots and in his back teeth. 40. Cole called. He was watching the gauge with complete attention, one hand on the torch, still ready, the other on the wrench at the intake. "Get the sledgehammer." Danny had it already. He was standing at the bypass valve with the hammer in both hands, and his feet set in the solid grounded stance of someone who has decided to commit. 45. The pipes groaned louder. Dust filtered down from the ceiling joists. The safety release on the valve body began to build toward its working pressure. "Dad," Danny said. "Wait," Cole said. 50. "Now." Danny swung with everything he had. The hammer connected with the bypass valve with a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed stone space. Nothing moved. The pressure climbed to 53. The safety whistle began to scream a sustained high note that filled the room. "Again," Cole said. "Hit it again." Danny swung again without hesitation, the full weight of his 17 years of frustration and fear and the specific anger of a young man who has watched his family diminish and has not had anything to hit until this moment. The sound this time was different. Under the impact there was a lower note, a tearing quality metal giving way to metal. The valve moved. A quarter turn. Then it stopped. Cole dropped the torch and grabbed the wrench and put his full body weight against the valve stem. He felt it give another fraction of a turn. Another. Then the pressure dropped. 51, 48, 45, and falling fast, the needle swinging back toward the working range. The safety whistle died. And then something happened that neither of them had been prepared for by anything Roy's napkin diagram had described. From somewhere deep in the building below, the basement, below the foundation, below the limestone of the cliff itself, came a sound that was not mechanical. It was a thump deep and resonant, followed by the sound of something moving through pipes, not steam, but liquid water moving through channels that had been closed for a very long time. The floor vibrated once a single deep pulse, and then a warmth began to rise from below, moving up through the stone of the floor, and with it came a smell mineral and faintly sulfurous and somehow ancient. Danny looked at the floor beneath their feet. The boiler system was connected to the well pump, Cole said, understanding it as he said it. Roy drew the connection on the napkin. When the bypass valve opened, it activated the pump. The steam system and the aquifer pump run off the same pressure source. He looked at the floor. Somewhere below them, the water was moving. The water that had been sealed since 1934 was moving through its channels again. They had not just started the heat, and they had opened the well. Then Danny said, "Dad." Cole turned. The door to the mechanical room was closed. He had left it propped open. The gap at the bottom of the door showed nothing at first. Then slowly, with a deliberate, incremental quality of something being introduced carefully into a space, smoke began to seep under it. Not the white steam of the system they had just pressurized. Black smoke, thick and chemical, and carrying with it unmistakably the sharp, clarifying smell of gasoline. The door handle was already hot when Cole touched it. He stepped back and looked at the room. The single high window on the far wall, the same window the intruder had used the previous night. He looked at it and calculated the cliff face on the other side and knew it was not a path for Rosie. "The hatch," Cole said. "Get the pry bar and the tire iron. Both of them." Danny had the pry bar off the floor before the sentence was finished. They jammed both tools into the spokes of the brass wheel and pushed. The smoke was thickening at floor level, rolling under the door in a widening dark layer, and Cole felt his eyes begin to respond to it even as he drove his weight through the tools. The wheel did not move. "Push harder," Cole said. "Don't think about it. Just push." They pushed. Both of them. Cole with his legs underneath the effort, driving through his hips the way you drive through a component that has not moved in decades and needs to believe you are serious. He felt Danny's full weight alongside his. The metal groaned. The smoke was at their knees now, the door behind them showing a thin orange glow at its lower edge. And the wheel moved. A quarter turn, a half turn, and then a sound that Cole felt as much as heard, a deep pressurized thump as the hatch released and swung up on its hinges, and a rush of air came up from below, heavy and mineral and faintly warm, and Cole had never in his life been more grateful for the smell of something ancient and underground. He was at the basement door shouting before the hatch had finished its arc. He heard running feet above him. In the 30 seconds it took Claire to bring the younger children down the back stairs and through the corridor, Cole had the flashlight on and the ladder visible in the shaft below. Rosie first. He took her by the hands and lowered her to the first rung and talked her down past the first 5 steps, and then Claire was there beside him, and they worked together without speaking because there was no time for speaking. Sam next, then Claire herself, then Danny. Cole looked back at the mechanical room door. The orange at its edges had deepened, and the smoke was moving fast now, rolling across the ceiling in a black wave. He grabbed the journal from the shelf where he had set it earlier. He checked for Roy's napkin in his jacket pocket. Both. He went down the ladder and pulled the hatch shut above him as the door behind him collapsed in a wash of light and heat that he heard but did not see. 70 rungs. He counted them in the dark boots, finding each by feel his children's voices below him, moving, present, breathing. At the bottom, his boots hit shallow water, and he swept the flashlight around. The cavern was vast in the way that underground spaces are vast when they have been shaped by geology rather than construction. The ceiling hung with formations that caught the flashlight beam and scattered it across the stone in fragments. The floor was uneven limestone, smoothed by centuries of water. Along the walls, the remnants of Cornelius Vane's operation, wooden crates stenciled with faded lettering, the rusted skeleton of a bottling apparatus, the tracks of a minecart system running into the darkness of a further tunnel. And at the center, in a natural bowl in the limestone, was the water. Cole had expected something underground in its appearance, something that bore the visual signature of having been hidden for a long time. What he found was the opposite. The water was extraordinary in its clarity. His flashlight passed through it without losing intensity, illuminating the pale limestone bottom as cleanly as sunlight through a window in early morning. It was warm steam moving across its surface in slow, unhurried tendrils. And it was alive in the specific way of things fed by deep geological processes rising from a fissure at the bowl's lowest point in a continuous, gentle pulse, as though the earth below was breathing. Cole knelt and cupped his hands and drank. It was unlike anything he had tasted. Mineral and clean, with a sweetness that was not sugar, but something older. Something that came from the rock itself, and a carbonation that was nothing like the sharp engineered fizz of bottled water, but soft and natural, more like the water was exhaling than bubbling. It settled in his stomach with a warmth that went beyond temperature. Sam was beside him, looking at the water with the complete focused attention he gave to any structure whose function he did not yet understand. "Is it safe?" Sam said. "Yes," Cole said. "It's safe. Drink it slowly." The tunnel to the ocean took 12 minutes in the dark, following the minecart tracks, in the growing salt smell, in the sound of surf that came cleaner and stronger with every minute they moved. The final section narrowed and required them to move in single file, and they emerged through a jagged slit in the cliff face into a small cove hidden beneath the cliff overhang, accessible from the water, but invisible from above. They stood on wet sand and looked up. The Harwick Grand was silhouetted on the cliff above them against a sky that was turning gray with dawn, and it was smoking. Not catastrophically. The fire had taken the kitchen wing and the corridor beyond it, but the stone walls of the mechanical room had held, and the Victorian structure of the main building was still standing damaged and scorched, but standing the way things built to last stand even when tested. The sirens started in the distance. Red lights moved in the fog somewhere on the road below the cliff. The climb up the goat path on the cliff face took 20 minutes. When they came over the top onto the gravel drive, 2 fire trucks were already there, and the crowd from town had gathered at the base of the drive in the particular configuration of people who have come to witness something they expected and are calibrating their response to what they actually found. Warren Goss was standing near his SUV in an attitude of careful practice concern, speaking to a man with a notepad who had the look of the local press. Cole walked through the crowd toward him, and the crowd parted in the way that crowds part when the person moving through them has a specific destination. Goss turned when Cole was 5 feet away. The color left his face in a sudden, complete way that Cole found more satisfying than anything he had felt in a long time. "We're not dead yet," Cole said. The confrontation that followed was brief and largely public. Cole told the assembled crowd, the reporter, 2 firefighters who had stopped to listen, and the deputy sheriff who had just arrived, that the basement door had been locked from outside, that the room had smelled of gasoline before the smoke came, that someone had attempted to burn the building down with 5 people inside. Goss recovered his composure within the minute. He always did. Men like Goss build their composure the way they build everything else to professional standards, with quality materials with an eye toward longevity. He told the deputy that the building was condemned and dangerous. He said he would be making a call to CPS first thing in the morning regarding the welfare of the children. He said it with the expression of a concerned citizen, which was the expression he used when he wanted to sound like a concerned citizen. From beneath the gravel through the stone foundation of the cliff came a sound. Cole felt it through his shoes before he heard it with his ears. Rhythmic, mechanical. The deep, steady pulse of the boiler running, pushing heat through 20-year dormant pipes, the heartbeat of a building that had been waiting to come back to life. "The heat is on, Cole," said to Vance, who was standing by the county van with his clipboard. "Your citation gave me 48 hours. Listen to what's under our feet. The primary hazard is remediated." The crowd heard it too. The boiler pulsed through the ground, patient and steady and continuing. Vance looked at his clipboard. He looked at Goss. He looked back at the clipboard with the expression of a man whose script has been revised without his consent. "The grace period stands," Vance said. Goss pulled Cole aside out of range of the cameras in the crowd. "You think that was a win," Goss said quietly. His voice was completely controlled. "It always was. I hold the note on your uncle's liens through a bank in Augusta. I can call the debt in 30 days and put you in receivership. And I have people in the state legislature who will be interested in the code situation here once I make a few phone calls." He looked at Cole with gray eyes that were entirely professional. "You've bought yourself days, Harwick. I own the week." He got in his SUV. Cole stood on the drive and watched the vehicle go. The crowd thinned over the next hour. The fire trucks packed up. The deputy left. The fog began to burn off as the morning advanced, revealing the full extent of the fire damage to the kitchen wing, the blown windows, the scorched siding. The main structure stood. The boiler ran. The next morning, before the children were awake, Cole made 3 trips down to the cavern with a bucket and came back up with 3 mason jars filled with water from the spring, sealed with lids he found in the ruined kitchen and wrapped in bubble wrap from the storage room. He found Betty when her shop opened. He asked to borrow her truck for a drive to Boston. He told her why. She handed him the keys without discussion. She also handed him a folded paper with the name and address of a laboratory in Boston and a handwritten line, "Ask for Dr. Park. Tell her it's Harwick Aquifer water. She knows the name." Betty had added the $80 to her envelope without explanation, and Cole had not argued, and now he had $122 between the cash he'd had and what she'd given him, and he was going to spend most of it on an expedited analysis at a laboratory in Boston, and it was the best investment he had ever made, even though he did not yet know the number it would return. He drove south on Route 1 with the mason jars on the passenger seat. At Kensington Analytical, he spent the last of the combined cash on a 48-hour expedited analysis. He sat in the waiting room for 6 hours with old magazines and a vending machine sandwich that cost $4 and tasted like an accurate representation of its value. Then he drove north. He was in New Hampshire when he pulled off at a rest stop and opened the envelope on the passenger seat of Betty's truck. He read the report once through. He read it again. He sat in the truck with the engine running for warmth and the report in his lap, and the lights of the rest stopped reflecting off the hood. pH 8.2 naturally alkaline. Electrolyte balance described as near perfect. Magnesium, calcium, potassium, sulfur trace compounds in optimal range. The lithium content naturally occurring at a concentration Dr. Park had marked with a specific notation documented mood-stabilizing properties at this concentration entirely within safe consumption parameters for daily use. A profile the report concluded that did not occur naturally in any commercially available water source currently on the market. At the bottom in Dr. Park's handwriting, conservatively water rights to an aquifer of this profile assuming sustainable yield would be valued at $200 million minimum in the current luxury wellness market. Cole folded the report and put it back in the envelope. $200 million. Beneath a building that was currently on fire in a small Maine harbor town where the inspector was a bribed functionary and the sheriff looked away, and the most powerful man in the county had been trying to steal it for 15 years from an old man who had refused to stop paying taxes on a condemned building because he was waiting for someone who could fix what he couldn't fix. He put the truck in gear. He crossed back into Maine as the afternoon light went flat and the sky over the ocean turned the color of old pewter. He came off the highway and onto Route 1, and then onto the county road toward Craig's Point, and 3 miles from the Lookout Point Road turnoff he saw what he had been afraid he would see. The road was blocked. A construction excavator sat diagonally across the pavement. 2 men in hard hats stood in front of it. "Emergency repairs," one of them said before Cole reached them. "Sinkhole. Road's closed." Cole looked at the road surface. He looked at the cell signal indicator on his phone. No service. He looked up at the ridge toward the cell tower. Its indicator light was dark. He looked at the 2 men. He looked at the sealed road. He thought about 4 children in a building above him with no way for him to reach them. He got out of the truck and he ran. Up the slope through the trees uphill for 25 minutes, his lungs burning, his left knee catching on a root at the 11-minute mark, and bleeding through his jeans for the rest of the climb, not stopping. When he came over the crest onto the gravel drive, the hotel was quiet. Too quiet. The front door was open. He went through the lobby at speed. The ballroom. Empty mattresses overturned. Claire's blue dress on the floor. Rosie's extra blanket in a heap by the door. Kitchen. Empty. Back corridor. Empty. He went out the front. On the porch column held with packing tape was a yellow sheet of paper. The seal of the Maine Department of Child and Family Services at the top. Emergency removal order. Reason abandoned minors in condemned structure. Location of children, state custody, Bangor Family Services. Cole read it once. He sat down on the porch steps. He bent forward and pressed his face into his hands and made a sound that he would not have wanted his children to hear, raw and complete, and without any of the management he had been applying to his fear for days. The gravel crunched beside him. Betty sat down on the step next to him. She had her truck keys in one hand and the expression of a woman who is furious on someone else's behalf. "I was here," she said. "I tried to stop them. The sheriff threatened me with obstruction." She paused. "Goss was there, Cole. He stood by his car and watched the whole thing. And he was smiling." Cole lifted his face. Betty reached into her coat and took out an envelope. "3 photographs taken through my store window across the road," she said. "Inspector Vance and Warren Goss 30 minutes before the CPS vehicle arrived. Shaking hands." Cole took the envelope. "Betty said my nephew runs a YouTube channel out of Portland. 2 million subscribers. Urban exploration, local history, that kind of thing." She looked at him steadily. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to fight this man the right way." "You tell me the word." Cole stood. The grief was still there. It did not go anywhere. It did not leave. But something settled over it like a second thing occupying the same space, cold and precise, and entirely different in temperature from grief. He looked at the hotel behind him. The boiler was still running. He could feel it. "Call him," Cole said. Betty took out her phone. "Tell him we found a prohibition tunnel under a condemned hotel on the Maine coast," Cole said. "Tell him a billionaire locked a father and 4 children in a burning building to steal a $200 million secret. Tell him there are photographs of the inspector who filed the CPS order shaking hands with the man who filed it. Tell him to bring every camera he owns." He looked at the Harwick Grand standing on the cliff edge in the dark. "Tell him tomorrow morning on the porch of this hotel, there's going to be a story worth driving through the night to cover." Betty was already dialing. Cole went inside to prepare. The numbers were already memorized. He had read the Kensington report twice at the rest stop in New Hampshire, sitting in the cab of Betty's truck with the engine running for warmth, and by the time he had folded the pages back into the envelope, the figures had arranged themselves into something permanent inside him. pH 8.2. Electrolyte balance near perfect. Lithium content at the therapeutic edge of the safe range. $200 million conservatively for the water rights alone. He had driven north with that number sitting on the passenger seat like a passenger that did not need to say anything. Now it was past midnight, and the hotel was quiet around him, and Cole sat at the front desk with Virgil's journal open in his lap and thought not about the money but about the man who had known about the money for 30 years and had chosen to keep it sealed beneath a condemned building rather than let it be taken by someone who would extract it and sell the empty hole to the next buyer. He picked up the journal and opened it to the first entry. He read it from the beginning this time. Not the last page, not the margin note. From the very first line, written in a hand that was steady and certain in the earlier entries and became progressively more labored as the years advanced and the illness advanced with them. The entries were not what Cole had expected. He had expected eccentricity, the ramblings of a man the family had written off. What he found instead was the careful, methodical record of someone who had been paying close attention to specific things for a very long time. The aquifer levels recorded seasonally. The town's economic contraction documented with the precision of a man who has decided that someone should be keeping the record. The periodic appearances of Warren Goss each offer more sophisticated than the last, each refusal noted, with the same flat brevity. And among the local entries woven into the record of the aquifer and the town and the offers refused were entries about Cole. They appeared sporadically at first and then with increasing frequency after a certain date. Cole found that date. It was 3.5 years ago. Cole's wife passed last winter. The entry read, "He's alone with 4 kids now and no help and a job at a diesel shop that pays him less than he's worth. I drove to Detroit. I sat in the parking lot of the apartment building on Clement Street for 2 hours. I could see the light in the kitchen window on the basement level. I didn't go up. I have spent 40 years being too proud to do the simple things and too stubborn to admit that the simple things were what mattered. I sent the medication for the girl anonymously through a pharmacy in Dearborn. It is not enough. It is the best I know how to do from this distance." Cole set the journal down on the desk. He stood very still in the lobby of the Harwick Grand for a long moment in the light of the single working sconce bulb, in the quiet of a building that was technically condemned and technically on fire in one wing and technically worth $200 million somewhere below his feet. He thought about $60 medication that had appeared anonymously 3 times in the past 2 years when they couldn't afford the refill. He had thought it was a pharmacy error, a government program, some administrative quirk he hadn't understood but had not questioned because Rosie needed it. He picked up the journal and kept reading. The later entries were the hardest to read, not because they were emotionally manipulative, but because they were honest in the way that people become honest only when they understand they are running out of time. The handwriting deteriorated, the lines drifted, but the clarity of what was being said sharpened as the physical control weakened the way light concentrates as it narrows. I have left the envelope with Marcia an entry near the end read, I know what that will look like to Cole. I know he will see her take the cachet and conclude she is what she appears to be. She is not. She is a woman who was given a difficult life and has done what she needed to do to survive it. I asked her to hold the envelope without telling her what was in it. She agreed. She is more trustworthy than she appears to be, which is the truest thing I can say about almost anyone. Cole read this twice, hearing it against the memory of the conference room in Boston. The fur coat, the sharp sound of satisfaction. When the cash figure was read, the look he had interpreted as contempt. He had read it wrong. He read further. I watched from a distance because I was too proud and too frightened to reach out. Virgil had written in the last full entry, the handwriting here the most uneven of all, pressing, too hard, and then too lightly in alternating sentences. I told myself he was better off without contact from the family eccentric. That distance was a kindness, that I was protecting him from inheriting my failures along with whatever I had that was worth having. These were lies I constructed because they were more comfortable than the truth, which is that I was afraid. Afraid he would look at what I had built, this crumbling monument to stubbornness, and decide that the family consensus was right and I had wasted everything. Cole, I am sorry it took me so long. I am sorry I sent money through the mail instead of coming to the door. I am sorry you never knew I was watching, and that knowing it this way is a very poor substitute for having been there. I hope it is worth something anyway, even at this distance and this late. This hotel is my apology. It is also a test, but not of the kind you might expect. Not of your intelligence or your courage, though it will require both. It is a test of whether you believe at the bottom of everything that you are the kind of person that things like this happen to. Because you are. You always were. You just needed something worth fighting for that was also yours. Make it something worth inheriting. Cole, I'm sorry I couldn't give you more time. Cole closed the journal. He sat with it closed in his lap for a long time. Outside the windows of the Harwick Grand, the Maine coast was doing what it does in the hour before dawn, gathering itself, the darkness condensing before it breaks the ocean, sound deepening the fog, making its final advance against the glass. Cole sat with what the journal had given him and felt something that had no common name. It was not grief exactly, though grief was inside it. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was there too. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who had watched from too far away and had known they were too far away and had not been able to change it and had done the best they knew how to do within the distance they had imposed on themselves. It was the feeling of being loved badly and genuinely at the same time, and of understanding that the love was real, even though the expression of it had been insufficient, and of knowing it too late to tell the person so. He sat with it. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and went to find the suit. It was the only one he owned, the dark charcoal he had worn to the estate reading in Boston, hanging on the hook in the old coat room off the lobby. It was wrinkled from the drive and carried a faint smell of smoke from the night of the fire. But when he put it on and looked at himself in the cracked mirror behind the front desk, he saw something that was less about the suit and more about the expression on the face inside it. He looked like a man who had arrived at a decision. That was enough. It would have to be. He spent the remaining hours before dawn in the cavern. He found the glass bottles in the storage room behind the bar, a full case of the old-fashioned swing-top variety, dusty but intact, the kind of bottle that communicates something specific about what it contains. He carried them down the ladder to the cavern and rinsed each one in the spring water until the water ran completely clear. He filled them one by one, holding each bottle below the surface, watching the mineral water fill the clear glass until not a single bubble remained. He capped each one and lined them up on the flat limestone beside the pool. In the old office on the ground floor, he found a label maker with a dead cartridge. He replaced the cartridge with one from the supply room that Betty had thought to include and printed the labels in the quiet of the early morning, pressing each one down level and even. Harwick, 1922. The Water of Life. Craggs Point, Maine. He carried them up and set them on the front desk. 12 bottles in a row, their labels straight, the water inside them catching the sconce light and holding it. He sat in the lobby chair with Virgil's journal in his lap and waited for morning. He did not sleep. The first vehicle arrived at 6:47, not a county vehicle, not a black SUV. A white van with a satellite dish on its roof and WGME News Portland in clean block letters on its side. It was followed 2 minutes later by a second news van from Augusta, and then a pickup truck with a young man at the wheel who had the particular forward-leaning energy of someone with 2 million subscribers who has been told there is a story here worth driving through the night for. Betty's nephew. He had brought a tripod, a gimbal, a wireless microphone setup, and the alert, precise confidence of someone who knows how to recognize when something real is happening and how to put it in front of people who need to see it. By 7:15, there were 9 vehicles on the gravel drive. People stood in the cold morning air, talking into phones and arranging equipment, and looking at the Harwick Grand with the assessing attention of people who are trying to understand a building quickly. The story had found its audience overnight in the way that certain stories do not, through promotion but through recognition. People had looked at the headline and seen in it the shape of something they already understood and had been waiting for someone to fight. 4,000 comments, Betty's nephew told Cole when he arrived, shared twice by national accounts. Journalists coming up from Boston. He looked at Cole with professional assessment. "Are you ready?" Cole looked at the assembled vehicles and the people with cameras and the gray main sky over the cliff. He thought about everything that had led here. The pink eviction notice on a kitchen table in Detroit, the envelope from Boston in a wet mailbox, the gravel driveway in the fog, the hatch in the basement floor, Danny's sledgehammer at exactly the right moment, a Polaroid photograph with fresh ink on its back, an old man in a wheelchair who had drawn a diagram on a napkin from memory. The water below his feet moving upward through the limestone the way it had always moved. He was ready. He was standing at the porch railing when the black SUV came up Lookout Point Road faster than it had ever come up before the tires throwing gravel at the crest, swerving around 2 of the parked media vehicles, with the controlled aggression of a man who is running behind the schedule he had planned and is not accustomed to that experience. Warren Goss stepped out of the SUV with the energy of a man who has not slept and has arrived somewhere he intended to control and has found that the situation has been developing without him. His composure was intact. It was always intact. But it was laboring now doing work that it had not previously been required to do, and Cole could see the effort in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his eyes. "Get these people off this property," Goss said, and then registering the cameras oriented toward him, adjusted. "This is private property. There are active code violations and ongoing safety concerns. I am here in my capacity as a concerned neighbor with a legal interest in the estate liens, and I strongly recommend everyone step back and allow the appropriate authorities to manage this situation." He said it well. He always said things well. Cole stepped up to the porch railing. "It's not your property, Warren," he said. The words carried across the gravel drive and the assembled crowd without any effort, because Cole had stopped managing his voice for any particular effect, and the result was a clarity that required no amplification. The cameras turned. Goss looked up at Cole on the porch above him. He looked at the cameras. He looked at the people from Craig's Point who had gathered at the base of the drive, Betty among them, and others that Cole recognized from the hardware store and the gas station, and the Harbor Road people who had been watching Goss acquire and diminish their town for 2 years and had not had anywhere to put the watching until now. "Warren Goss tried to burn this hotel down," Cole said. He was clear and level and unhurried. There were 4 children inside. He sent someone to lock the door and start the fire, and he waited. He used a corrupt inspector and fraudulent claims to take my children while I was away from the property. And he has been attempting to acquire this land through bribery, intimidation, and fraud for 15 years, beginning with my uncle Virgil Harwick, who spent 30 years and every dollar he had keeping this building standing, so the truth beneath it could not be buried. He reached into his jacket and held up the Kensington Analytical Report. "Under this hotel," he said, "there is a natural spring, a thermal aquifer with a mineral profile that does not exist in any commercial water source currently on the market. The water rights belong to this estate by grandfathered state deed. The independent valuation of those rights is $200 million. The number sat in the cold October air. It was not primarily a number about money, though it was also that. It was a number about what Virgil Harwick had thought was worth 30 years of his life. It was a number about what Warren Goss had thought was worth burning a building down with people inside it. It was a number that explained everything that had seemed inexplicable and connected everything that had seemed disconnected. I am not selling this property, Cole said. I am not selling the water rights. I am forming a community trust. The Harwick Grand will operate as a resort and spa. The water bottling operation will be structured as a cooperative with shared ownership available to every family in Craigs Point. Every household pushed out or priced out or squeezed out by the development pressure in this town over the past 5 years will have the opportunity to buy in at founding member rates. He looked at Goss. The profits will fund a new school, a rebuilt fire station, and a property tax reduction for every home owner in this county. The silence after this was the kind of silence that contains multiple responses being formed simultaneously, the crowd processing something that was more and different from what they had come to witness. Goss moved toward the porch steps with the controlled forward motion of a man who intends to retake the center of something. This is performance, he said, with the measured delivery of a man who has faced cameras before and knows how to use them. Mr. Harwick is making claims he cannot substantiate about a condemned property. He has no legal right to operate with liens he cannot pay and water rights that are under active legal dispute. I have a legal team that will have this property in receivership within 30 days. The liens are not disputed. Everyone turned. Marcia was standing at the edge of the drive between two of the media vehicles. She was wearing a plain dark coat that Cole did not recognize, nothing like the fur coat from Boston, and she was holding a sealed envelope. She walked forward through the crowd without hurrying and stopped at the base of the porch steps. She looked up at Cole. She looked at the envelope. Her face had the expression of someone who has been carrying something that was not theirs to carry and has finally arrived at the place where it can be set down. Virgil gave me this, she said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment for a long time. He gave it to me before he died and told me to hold it until Goss came for the hotel. She looked at Warren Goss. You came. She held the envelope up to Cole. Cole came down the porch steps and took it. He broke the seal and opened out it. Inside were two documents. The first was a single page on paper that had the particular weight and texture of official state documents from an earlier era, the kind of paper that knows what it is and carries the knowledge with gravity. At the top was the seal of the state of Maine. Below it, in formal legal typeface, the text of a water rights grant dated 1968, signed by the Secretary of State and the Director of the Maine Bureau of Natural Resources. The grant conveyed exclusive rights to the commercial development of the thermal aquifer at the coordinates of the Harwick Grand Hotel property to Virgil Harwick and his designated heirs in perpetuity, contingent on continued ownership of the above-referenced parcel. In perpetuity. Cole looked at the second document, a notarized affidavit from a state geologist dated 1989, confirming that the aquifer at the Harwick Grand coordinates was geologically active, sustainable under commercial extraction at regulated rates and inseparably associated with the surface parcel described in the 1968 grant. He looked at both documents. He looked at Marcia. He said nothing for a moment because there was a great deal to say, and the right beginning of it was difficult to locate quickly inside everything he was feeling. Thank you, he said. He said it simply, without ceremony, because Virgil had been right about her and Cole had been wrong, and this was the beginning of saying, so the first step of a longer accounting that would take more time than this morning allowed. Marcia looked at the hotel over Cole's shoulder. Her expression was something that Cole was only beginning to be able to read accurately, and what he read in it now was closer to relief than anything else. The specific relief of someone who has been holding something heavy on behalf of someone else and has finally been able to put it down. He said, you'd need it more than I needed the money, Marcia said. She paused. He was right. He usually was. Just always about the wrong things at the wrong time. She turned and walked back through the crowd without looking back. Cole held the documents up to the assembled cameras. There is nothing to dispute, he said to Goss. Warren Goss stood on the gravel drive of the Harwick Grand and looked at the documents. He looked at the cameras. He looked at the people from town who had moved to surround his SUV, in the quiet, determined way of people who have reached the limit of their patience and are no longer simply watching. He looked at Cole on the porch steps in the wrinkled suit with 30 years of a dying man's patience in his hands. For a moment, Goss was completely still. Then he moved toward his vehicle, and it was in that single step that Cole saw what Warren Goss actually was stripped of: the composure and the suit and the practiced warmth and the 2 decades of turning everything he touched into something he owned. He was a man who had never been refused by someone who had nothing and had not thought to build any internal mechanism for handling it. Sheriff Dolan stepped into his path. Dolan was not a complicated man and had not in the past 2 years been a particularly courageous one. He had made the choices of a man who tells himself that accommodation is pragmatism and that the things he does not do are not the same as the things he does. He had told himself this long enough and with enough conviction that it had nearly become true. But the sight of 4 children loaded into a state vehicle while their father was 3 hours down the road had been the moment that cut through everything he had been telling himself, and he had not been able to unsee it, and it had kept him awake through the night and brought him up Lookout Point Road before any of the media vans arrived. He held a folded paper in one hand. Warren Goss, Dolan said, and his voice had the quality of a decision that has been made and is being acted on, which is a different quality than authority borrowed from a badge. I have a warrant for your arrest. Arson, reckless endangerment, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and there are federal investigators from the state attorney general's office on their way regarding the bribery allegations. He paused. I also have a statement from Inspector Vance, who came to my house at 6 this morning. He said that last part without pleasure. Goss looked at the warrant. He looked at the cameras. He looked at Cole. The composure did not break. It had been built too carefully for that over too many years, with too much invested in its maintenance. But it went hollow the way a structural element goes hollow when what was supporting it from inside has been removed. The surface held, but the substance behind it was gone. The handcuffs made a sound that carried clearly across the gravel drive in the cold morning air. The crowd did not cheer. This was not a crowd built for cheering. These were people who had been losing ground slowly for years, and what they felt at this moment was not the sharp explosion of sudden victory, but something that moved through them more slowly and more completely, a release of pressure that had been building for a long time in the specific way that pressure builds in systems that have no outlet. A collective exhale, many people breathing out at the same time. Cole watched Goss put into the sheriff's vehicle. He watched the door close. He stood on the steps and held the water rights documents and felt the cold air on his face and the pulse of the boiler through the soles of his shoes. Then he heard it, Dad. He turned. The black sedan had come up the road in all the noise and movement without anyone particularly noticing, and it was stopped at the edge of the drive, and the rear door was open, and Rosie was running across the gravel with patches in one arm and her other arm already reaching for him, and Cole was off the porch and across the gravel and had her before she had covered half the distance, catching her, mid-stride, lifting her and holding her against his chest, and she pressed her face into his collar and put both arms around his neck, and the bear was crushed between them. Then Danny coming around the side of the car, and Claire behind him, and Sam. Cole went to his knees on the gravel. He held all 4 of them at once, his arms not quite long enough to go around all of them, his face pressed into the combined warmth of their hair. He did not try to manage any part of what he felt. He did not try to compose his face for the cameras, or moderate the sound he made, or find any way to be anything other than what he was, which was a father who had been very afraid of losing his children and was now holding them in a gravel driveway on a Maine cliff in October, weeping openly in front of a crowd of strangers and caring not at all. He wept the way a man weeps when the thing he was most afraid of losing turns out to still be there. All of it came through him. The pink eviction notice, the $42, the fog on Lookout Point Road, the fire and the smoke and the hatch and the ladder down through the dark into the ancient water. Goss's hand he had refused on the gravel the first afternoon. The valve at 50 psi, the napkin in his jacket pocket. A Polaroid with 9 words in fresh ink. It all came through him and came out as something that had no name but felt like the specific shape of everything he had been carrying, and he let it. The cameras kept rolling. Nobody stopped them. Danny pulled back after a moment and looked at his father with the face of someone who has been afraid for a sustained period and is recalibrating to the understanding that the afraid time is over. He looked at the hotel. He looked back at Cole. "You actually did it," Danny said. "Not alone," Cole said. He stood. He put Rosie down but kept her hand. He looked at his 4 children in the gray morning light and thought about what Virgil had written about tests and what they test for, and understood that what he had passed was not a test of cleverness or even of courage, but of the willingness to believe that things like this could happen to someone like him. That had been the hardest part. That had been what Virgil had seen from a parking lot in Detroit and had bet 30 years on. Betty appeared at his elbow with coffee from a thermos that had appeared from somewhere in her truck. She handed him a cup without speaking and stood beside him and looked out at the assembled crowd and the harbor town below the cliff and the gray Atlantic beyond it all. "Your uncle was a stubborn man," Betty said. Cole drank the coffee. "So am I," he said. The weeks that followed required patience and expertise that Cole did not start with and had to acquire. The legal architecture of Virgil's construction, the water rights grant, the estate structure, the grandfathering provisions, and their interaction with current Maine property law required a careful hand and a specific kind of knowledge. Cole retained Susan Briggs, an attorney from Portland, who had spent her career on exactly this variety of case and who watched the footage of the press conference 3 times on her laptop before she called him back and told him she would work on contingency. Goss's liens on the estate were challenged on the grounds of fraudulent transfer in bad faith by the holding bank. The challenge was heard in a Portland court 6 weeks after the press conference and was decided with an unusual speed and decisiveness that the legal correspondent for the Boston Globe described in print as reflecting the particular clarity of a case where the documentary evidence left little room for interpretation. Inspector Vance had presented himself at Dolan's house at 6 in the morning with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is moving through it before he can change his mind. His testimony established a pattern of coordinated code enforcement action directed by Goss that extended back 2 years and included multiple properties across Craig's Point. The federal investigators who arrived the week after the press conference found the bank records Cole had referenced and found them informative. The Harwick Grand underwent structural assessment by a firm from Portland that Roy Callahan recommended through the grandson of the man who had originally built it. The assessment confirmed in formal professional language what the building had already demonstrated by surviving a fire set inside it. The Victorian stonework and hardwood construction were fundamentally sound. The damage was real and repairable. The bones were good. Cole managed the renovation himself, learning what he didn't know from the contractors he hired and from books and from the specific problem-solving intelligence of a man who has spent his life understanding how things work and applying that understanding to new situations. Betty's network of local tradespeople materialized in numbers he had not anticipated, men and women who had been priced out of contract work by Goss's preferred vendors, and who came to the Harwick not only for the work, but because this was their town, and this was now, in some real sense, their building. And they understood the difference between work you do for a paycheck and work you do because the thing matters. The community trust was structured with the help of a cooperative attorney from Rockland who had set up similar organizations for fishing cooperatives along the coast and who found the water rights dimension novel enough to engage her full attention. The founding membership offer was designed to be accessible rather than exclusive, requiring genuine commitment without prohibitive capital. 112 founding members signed on in the first 60 days. One of them was Marcia. She had bought a founding share with part of the cash Virgil had left her, and she attended the first community meeting without being invited, arriving early and sitting in the 3rd row and saying nothing during the meeting, but listening with the focused attention of someone who intends to stay informed. Cole had called her before the offer went public. The conversation was not long and not comfortable and was necessary. When it ended, something that had been at an angle between them was a degree or two straighter, which was where they began. Roy Callahan came to the soft opening in his wheelchair, pushed by the young aide from Millbrook, who had heard enough about the Harwick Grand to feel personally invested. He sat in the lobby for 2 hours and looked at the restored chandelier and the refinished floors in the reception desk polished back to its original grain. When Cole thanked him, he made a dismissive gesture with one large still hand. "Virgil did the hard part," Roy said. He held it. "You just unlocked it." He looked up at the chandelier. "Cornelius Vane put that up," Roy said. "He was a bad man by most measures. but he had good taste in light. The formal grand opening was on a Saturday in October, exactly 1 year and 4 days after Cole had stood on the gravel drive with $40 in his pocket and a tire iron in his hand and pushed open the doors of the Harwick Grand for the first time. The parking lot told the story of what the trust had become. Luxury rental cars from Portland and Boston and as far as New York, their passengers wearing the clothes that speak of disposable income and an interest in the specific variety of wellness that costs money to pursue. And beside them, the pickup trucks and salt-rusted sedans of Crags Point and the surrounding county, their owners in the clean clothes of people who are attending something that is theirs. Cole stood on the second-floor balcony above the lobby and looked at it. The restored building below him, the chandelier throwing light across the crowd in the way that this particular chandelier had been designed to throw light when Cornelius Vane had installed it in 1920 for purposes that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with impression. The front desk polished to its original surface. The Harwick 1922 bottles and carafes on every horizontal surface, the water in them clear and faintly sparkling under the chandeliers. Behind him through the open balcony door came the sound of his children. Danny arrived first and stood at the railing in the suit that fit him properly, bought for the occasion that made him look older than 17 in some lights and exactly 17 in others, which was the right combination. He had his MIT acceptance letter on his phone and had shown it to everyone who had stood still long enough. He had been accepted on the strength of an application essay about pressure systems and the physics of fluid mechanics, in an unconventional argument about what the study of engineering actually teaches, which his guidance counselor had called the most unusual college essay she had read in 22 years. Claire came out behind him and stood at the railing and looked at the crowd below with the assessing composure that she had possessed since she was 12, and that had become something more directed in the past year, something that pointed forward rather than simply holding steady. She was planning something. Cole could see it in the quality of her attention. He did not ask what it was yet. He suspected it was ambitious. Sam leaned on the railing with his sketchbook open, drawing the chandelier from above, working out the geometry of the light distribution with the focused pleasure of a boy for whom understanding how a thing works is the same as loving it. And Rosie came through the door last in a dress that was pale blue and slightly too large because she had grown 3 inches in the past year. The clean ocean air and the Dr. Cole could now afford having achieved together what the damp basement apartment in Detroit had been working against. She breathed without effort. She was holding Patches because Patches went everywhere and always would, but she was holding him loosely the way you hold something you love when the love is no longer about needing to hold on. She looked at the crowd below and then up at her father. "Are those all our people?" she said. Cole looked at the lobby. The founding members and the journalists and the Crags Point families and Betty near the front desk talking to Roy's aide while Roy watched the proceedings with the contained satisfaction of a man who has lived long enough to see the right ending. Marcia in the third row of seats, straight-backed listening. "Yeah," Cole said, "those are all our people." He put his hand on Rosie's shoulder. They stood there for a moment, the 5 of them on the balcony, before Cole was needed downstairs for the toast. He was aware in the particular way you become aware of things that are almost over, that this was one of the moments that stays. Not because it would be remembered with complete accuracy, because memory is never completely accurate, but because it was the kind of moment that leaves its mark on the structure of a person, the way water leaves its mark on stone. Gradually, indelibly, over time. Danny said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said, in the basement, about what they see." Cole waited. "I think I know what I want them to see," Danny said, "when it's my turn." Cole looked at his son, this 17-year-old, who had carried more than his age warranted and had carried it without complaint, and was now standing on a balcony above a lobby full of people holding a college acceptance letter on his phone and looking forward rather than back. "Yeah," Cole said, "I think you do." He went downstairs. The lobby was warm with bodies and voices and the smell of the water arranged in carafes on every surface. The Harwick 1922 bottles catching the chandelier light and spreading it across the walls in small, slow-moving reflections. Cole moved through the crowd, and people spoke to him, and he spoke back and shook the hands offered and meant every one of them, because these were the people who had been paying the price of living in a place a man with money had decided to own, and who had gone on paying it without having anywhere to put the paying until a father from Detroit had refused to sign a piece of paper on a gravel driveway in the fog. He stopped at the front desk. On the wall behind the desk, two things had been framed and mounted side by side. The first was the final notice of eviction from 1140 Clement Street apartment, 2B, Detroit, Michigan. Its neon pink paper had faded slightly, but its bold black font was still perfectly legible. The paper had a wrinkle at one corner from where it had been face down on a Formica kitchen table on a rainy October night, while a man stared at his hands and believed there was no way forward. The second was a portrait photograph of Virgil Harwick taken in the 1970s by a photographer whose name was written in pencil on the back. Virgil was in his 30s in the image, standing on the porch of the Harwick Grand, in summer, one hand on the railing, looking at something beyond the camera's frame, with the expression of a man who is looking at something he has decided to keep. Cole looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he turned to the room. Betty handed him a glass. The water was cool against his palm and slightly warm inside his fingers, and the geothermal heat of the deep rock carried up through the mineral clarity of it. It caught the chandelier light and held it in the way that very clear things hold light, not by reflecting it back, but by making it visible from within. The room settled into quiet. Cole looked at the crowd, at the founding members and the journalists and the people from town and his four children on the balcony above looking down. He had written something out 2 nights ago and had folded the paper and left it on the desk because when he read it back, it said the right things in the wrong order, and what he actually wanted to say was simpler than anything he had written. He raised the glass. To Virgil, he said, who watched from a distance when he should have knocked on the door, who left us a ruin when he could have left us nothing, who trusted us to understand the difference between what something looks like and what it is, and who knew better than anyone that the things most worth having are the ones that require you to believe you deserve them. He paused, and to the water he said, which was here before all of us and will be here after all of us, and which doesn't care about any of our arguments except the one we had on its behalf. To Virgil, the room said, Cole drank. It tasted the way it had tasted the first time kneeling in a cavern beneath a burning building with 4 children behind him and his hands cupped below the surface. Clean and mineral and faintly sweet, the carbonation rising soft and easy, like a slow exhale from something that had been holding its breath for a long time and was finally allowed to breathe. It settled in him with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He set the glass on the front desk beside the framed eviction notice. He looked up at his children on the balcony. They looked back at him, below the Harwick Grand, far below the limestone floor of the lobby and the stone foundation of the cliff and the geological strata that had been accumulating since before any human had stood on this coast. The water moved. It rose from wherever it rose from, following the pressure differential of deep geothermal processes, moving upward through fissure and channel in the rock, unhurried and specific and entirely itself. It had been doing this before Cornelius Vane drilled his test bore in 1919. It had been doing this through the shuddering and the condemnation and the 30 years of an old man's patient waiting, and the fire and the flood of cameras on the gravel drive, and the press conference, and the legal proceedings, and the renovation, and this opening night, and all of it. The water did not know about any of this. It simply moved toward the surface the way water does, the way things with sufficient pressure and sufficient time always eventually do. Up through the dark, into the light.